On the edge of a quiet coast where the land finally surrenders to the sea, there stood a lighthouse that had watched over the water for longer than any villager could remember. It was a tall white tower with a red cap, and at its base lived a gentle keeper who tended the lamp each night with patient hands. The tower had been built by hands long turned to dust, its stones worn smooth by 100 years of salt wind, and still it stood as steady as the day the first flame had been lit within it. The keepers who came before had all been solitary souls, men who asked little of the world and gave much to the ships that passed in the dark, and the keeper felt himself the latest in a long line of quiet watchers. He liked to think that the tower itself remembered them, that the worn spiral of the stair held the echoes of every foot that had climbed it before him. The keeper was a man in his 40s with a short salt and pepper beard the color of sea foam and eyes that held the calm of still water. He had come to the coast many years before, when the grief of losing someone he loved had driven him to seek a place where the horizon offered no answers but only peace. In the early days he had spoken to no one for weeks at a time, finding in the company of the waves a silence that asked nothing of him and gave back only the simple certainty of the tide. He had learned to read the sea as another might read a face, knowing by the color of the water and the shape of the foam whether the night would be kind or cruel. The waves below the cliff were never angry, only restless, rolling in and out with a rhythm that seemed to breathe for the whole world. Each evening as the sun dipped low, the keeper climbed the spiral stair to light the great lamp, and the beam would sweep across the darkening water to guide the fishing boats safely home. There was a particular comfort in the lighting of the lamp, a small ceremony of strike and wick and the sudden blooming of gold that never failed to quiet his restless mind. He would stand for a moment in the glow, warming his hands at the glass, and watch the beam cut its slow arc across the gathering dark until the last boat had slipped into the sheltered harbor. Only then would he descend, the day's vigil complete, to the warm solitude of his small room where the kettle already steamed and the logbook waited with its familiar questions of wind and weather. It was a life of repetition, and repetition, he had learned, was its own kind of healing, for the sea did not care for his sorrow and so gave him leave to set it down. The village beyond the dunes was small and unhurried, a cluster of whitewashed cottages with blue shutters and gardens full of lavender that smelled of summer even in winter. The people there made their living from the water, mending nets and smoking fish and building boats with the same patient care the keeper gave his lamp, and they regarded the tower with a fondness that bordered on reverence. Children there grew up knowing the lighthouse as a friend, a silent guardian whose light meant that someone was awake and watching while they slept. They would point to it from their beds on stormy nights and feel safer for the steady turning they could not see but always knew was there. On clear nights the keeper would sometimes sit on the rocks at the foot of the tower and listen to the water, feeling the cool spray on his face and the vastness of the night settle softly over his shoulders. He had made a quiet life of small rituals, of polishing the brass, of noting the weather in a leather-bound book, of feeding the gulls that nested on the ledges. There was a particular gull, bolder than the rest, that he had named Marble for the pale speckles on its wings, and it would perch on his windowsill each morning as if to check that he was still there. One spring morning the stillness of the coast was broken by the arrival of a small boat with a single passenger, a woman in her 40s with wind-tangled auburn hair streaked with silver and a satchel of sketches who said she had come to paint the sea. She introduced herself to no one at first, simply setting up her easel on the beach and watching the lighthouse as though it were a living thing. There was something in the way she tilted her head at the tower, as if listening for a voice only she could hear, that set her apart from the summer travelers who usually came and went without truly seeing. The keeper noticed her from his window and felt a faint curiosity, the first such feeling he had allowed himself in years. He found himself noting the color of her shawl against the sand and the particular stillness she carried, a stillness not unlike his own. She returned day after day, and slowly the villagers came to know her as the painter who smiled at everyone and spoke little about where she had been. The keeper found himself watching for her figure on the sand, and he told himself it was only because she often lingered past dusk when the light grew dangerous. When a storm threatened one evening, he walked down from the tower to warn her, his lantern swinging against the rising wind. She looked up from her canvas with eyes the blue of shallow water and thanked him, saying she had lost track of the hour as she always did when the sea was talking. They walked back together toward the village as the first drops fell, and he learned that she had left a city that had grown too loud for her, trading its noise for the honest sound of waves. She admitted she was searching for something she could not name, a feeling she had felt only once as a child by the ocean and had been chasing ever since. The keeper understood that search more than he cared to say, for he had spent a decade walking toward a horizon that never arrived. They parted at the path to the village, and he climbed back to his lamp with a warmth in his chest he had nearly forgotten existed. The days that followed settled into a gentle pattern, the painter sketching by day and the keeper tending his light by night, their paths crossing at the blue hour when the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. She began to bring him tea in a tin flask, and they would sit on the rocks while she described the colors she struggled to capture and he described the moods of the sea he had learned by heart. He spoke of the way the water held the light differently in each season, of the green glass calm of late summer and the leaden chop of a coming front, and she nodded as though committing each word to the same page as her colors. He told her of the ships that had passed in his years there, of the one that had not returned and the morning that had followed, of the way the lamp seemed to answer the grief of those who watched it. She listened without pity, only with a steady attention that made him feel seen rather than healed, and that was a different and rarer thing. In her presence the silence between them was not empty but full, like the pause in a song before the next note arrives. As the weeks passed the painter began to include the lighthouse in her work, first as a distant shape and then as the quiet center of every scene. She painted it at dawn wrapped in mist, at noon bright against a hard blue sky, and at night as a solitary glow above the sleeping water. She worked with a concentration that blurred the world away, her brush moving in small sure strokes that seemed to draw the very light out of the canvas rather than lay it down. The keeper, seeing his tower rendered with such tenderness, felt a shy pride, as though she had noticed something true about him that he had hidden even from himself. He had never thought of the tower as beautiful, only as necessary, and to see it beloved by another was to meet himself as a stranger he rather liked. One evening she showed him a finished piece, the lighthouse under a swelling moon with the waves rendered in long silver strokes, and he stood before it a long while without speaking. When he finally found words he said it looked like a place that was waiting for someone, and she said perhaps it had been waiting for him. Neither of them named the feeling that passed between them then, but the gull marble watched from the sill and seemed to approve. Summer came and with it the festival of the turning tide, when the village lit paper lanterns and set them drifting on the water to honor those lost at sea. The keeper had always remained apart from the festival, lighting his lamp early and retreating to his tower, but this year the painter took his hand and led him down to the shore. Together they watched the small lights bob and scatter across the black water like fallen stars finding their way home, and the keeper felt the old grief loosen its grip just enough to breathe. The painter released her own lantern and whispered a name he did not hear, and he released his and whispered the name he had carried for 10 years. They stood shoulder to shoulder as the lanterns drifted beyond reach, and for the first time the keeper did not feel alone inside his sorrow but accompanied by it, as one is accompanied by an old companion on a long road. The painter began to spend her evenings in the tower itself, climbing the spiral stair to sit beside him while he worked, sketching the beam as it swept the dark and the shadows it cast on the curved wall. He taught her the names of the stars that guided the sailors and the signs in the wind that warned of coming weather, and she taught him to see the sea not only as a duty but as a subject of endless wonder. They spoke of the lives they might have lived and the ones they had, and found in each other a forgiveness for the choices that had brought them, separately, to this same quiet coast. The gull marble grew accustomed to two visitors at the windowsill and divided its greedy attention between them with comical fairness. In the warm hush of those nights the lighthouse felt less like a post of lonely vigil and more like a home that had finally been furnished by company. Autumn arrived with winds that turned the sea to pewter and scattered the last of the lavender across the dunes. The afternoons grew short and the light turned amber and thin, and the two of them took to walking the beach at the hour when the tide withdrew and left the sand glossy and patterned with the small footprints of birds. The painter confessed one gray afternoon that her stay had been meant to be brief, a passing rest before she moved on to some other shore, but that the thought of leaving now felt like a small grief of its own. She spoke of the city she had left, not with bitterness but with the mild confusion of one who no longer recognized the person she had been there. The keeper, who had long believed he wanted only solitude, found the admission had opened a door he had kept bolted, and he surprised himself by saying he would miss the sound of her footsteps on the stair. They did not speak of what might come next, for the season was uncertain and the future had never been kind to plans made by the sea. Instead they simply let the days shorten and the lamp burn longer, storing up the warmth of the present against the cold that autumn promised. The waves kept their restless rhythm below, indifferent and eternal, and somehow that indifference was a comfort rather than a threat. Then came the night of the great gale, when the wind rose like a living thing and the sea threw itself against the cliff with a violence the keeper had not seen in all his years. The lamp shook in its housing and the tower groaned as if it might split, and far below a fishing boat that had been caught unawares sent up a distress flare that the keeper spotted through the rain. He moved at once to the signal, knowing the boat could not find the harbor mouth in such darkness without guidance, and the painter stood beside him without fear, holding the spare lantern to light his hands. Together they worked the old apparatus, sweeping the beam in the pattern that meant safe passage, and through the wild curtain of weather they saw at last the boat turn and limp toward the sheltered cove. When the flare did not rise again they knew the crew had made it, and the keeper let out a breath he had been holding since the first thunder of the waves. In the stillness after the storm, when the wind had spent itself and the dawn came pale and washed clean, the two of them stepped outside to find the world remade. The dunes were reshaped, a tree had fallen across the path, and the air smelled of salt and torn green things, but the lighthouse stood unharmed and the sea had returned to its gentle rolling as though nothing had happened. The villagers emerged blinking from their cottages and came down to the shore, and when they learned of the boat saved by the light there were tears and quiet cheers. The keeper looked at the painter, rain-streaked and calm, and realized that the search she had spoken of, the feeling she had chased since childhood, had perhaps been answered not by the sea alone but by the shared keeping of its light. She smiled as if she had read his thought, and took his hand there in the open morning where anyone might see. Winter settled over the coast with a softness that surprised them both, blanketing the dunes in white and freezing the edges of the tide into lace. The keeper lit the lamp earlier now and the painter kept him company through the long dark, and the tower became a small warm world of its own with a kettle always humming and sketches pinned to every wall. They took their meals by the window where the gray light fell on the water, and spoke of small things, of the bread that had risen too slow and the gull that had stolen a crust, and found in those small things a happiness that needed no grand occasion. They fell into a love that asked for nothing it did not already have, content in the simple fact of each other's presence against the vast and indifferent sea. The gull marble weathered the cold on the sheltered ledge and accepted the arrangement as one more minor blessing of the coast. On the coldest nights they would watch the beams sweep out and imagine the distant ships finding their way, and the keeper would murmur that the light was only worth anything because someone was there to keep it, and she would answer that the someone was worth anything because of the light they kept together. As the year turned toward spring again, the painter made a decision that had been forming in her like a slow tide, to stay not as a visitor passing through but as a keeper beside him, to learn the lamp and the log-book and the moods of the water until they were as familiar to her as to him. She practiced the climbing of the stair with the apprentice's steady pace, and learned to trim the wick and read the glass for the first fog of trouble, and found that the work suited her hands as the brush once had. The keeper, who had once feared that opening his door would only lead to another leaving, found instead that sharing the vigil made it lighter, as though grief divided between two hands became something bearable rather than something endured. They married in the village chapel with the lavender beginning to green again, and the whole small community came to celebrate, for they had quietly adopted the two as their own. The children who had always loved the lighthouse now had two guardians to wave to, and the fishing boats had two pairs of eyes watching from the tower as they ventured out and returned. The years that followed were not without their hard seasons, for the coast gave as readily as it took, and there were winters when the supply boat could not come and they lived on stored flour and the fish he caught from the rocks. There were nights when the lamp faltered and he climbed with trembling hands to mend it, and mornings when the painter woke from dreams of the city she had left and wondered, for a moment, if she had chosen rightly. There were springs of sickness when the fever took hold and one of them sat by the other's bed through the long watches, learning that love was mostly this, the keeping of another through the dark until the light returned. But each time the sea returned to its gentle roll and the light returned to its steady turn, and they found again the quiet certainty that had first drawn them together on that wind-blown beach. The villagers grew used to seeing the two of them as a single fixture of the shore, as natural as the lighthouse itself, and the children who had waved from the dunes grew up and brought their own children to wave in turn. The painter's sketches, pinned and repinned across the years, came to cover every wall of the tower until it seemed the whole coast lived inside, captured in silver and plum and the particular blue of shallow water. They taught a young apprentice from the village the ways of the light so that the knowledge would not die with them, a boy who climbed the stair with the same wonder they had once known. The apprentice learned to read the sky and to love the silence, and in his wide eyes the keeper saw the reflection of his younger self, the man who had first come to the coast with a wounded heart. The painter showed the boy how to mix the exact silver of the waves and the exact plum of the dusk, and he learned that keeping a light was also a kind of art, a way of making something steady in a world that was always moving. The gull marble was long gone by then, but others came and went, and the windowsill was never empty for long. They weathered storms and calm alike, and through it all the sea rolled in and out with its eternal breathing, a sound that had become the background of their happiness rather than the echo of their loss. On clear nights they would sit on the rocks as they had that first spring, now two weathered companions side by side, and feel the vast night settle over them not as a weight but as a blessing. They spoke little in those last years, for there was little left unsaid between them, and the silence they shared was the deepest conversation of all. The keeper would sometimes reach for her hand and find it already there, as though their bodies had learned the habit of seeking each other without thought. They remembered together the storm that had sealed their bond and the festival where they had first released their lanterns, and found that memory, shared, lost its power to wound and kept only its power to warm. The beam swept its circle above them, and the fishing boats passed in the dark below, and the world went on exactly as it always had, which was the thing they had most wanted. They had, without meaning to, become the answer to the search they had each begun alone, and the answer was simply this: to be known, and to keep watch, and to let the sea do the rest. And when at last the keeper's time came to set down his lantern for the final time, he did so not with sorrow but with the quiet certainty that the light would continue, kept now by the one who had found him and by the apprentice who would follow. He asked only that they open the window that night so the sound of the waves might reach him, and there in the small room with the painted coast upon the walls he slipped from his long vigil as gently as the tide withdraws. The painter, though she grieved, did not grieve alone, for the coast and the village and the sea itself seemed to hold her as she had once been held. She lit the lamp that evening as she had learned to do, and the beam swept out across the water just as it always had, a steady promise that someone was awake and watching while the world slept. The waves below the cliff were never angry, only restless, rolling in and out with the rhythm that breathes for us all, and under that same red cap the light went on keeping its gentle watch. So the lighthouse remains on the edge of the quiet coast, a white tower with a red cap and a lamp that has outlasted every grief brought to its foot. Those who pass by sea still find their way by its steady turning, and those who pass by land still feel, without knowing why, a small lifting of the heart at the sight of it. The story of the keeper and the painter is not written in any book, but it is told in the way the light falls on the water each night and in the way the waves answer with their endless, gentle roll. The apprentice grew old in his turn and taught another, and the line of quiet watchers stretched unbroken into the years no one living could count. And if you ever stand on that shore at the blue hour, when the sky turns the color of a bruised plum, you may feel a presence of quiet companionship in the air, as though two old friends were still sitting on the rocks, watching the sea, and keeping watch so that you might rest. The waves will tell you, if you listen, that nothing is truly lost that is loved, and that the light, once kindled in another's name, goes on burning long after the kindler is gone, carried forward by every hand that learns to keep it, and by every heart that learns to be kept.